welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of several fabulous things, but of one extremely fabulous thing that we are here to discuss today. I was just saying that I am 5 pages from the end, and I am having the time of my life. This is an utter joyride of a book, and I am so excited to talk about it. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Meg Elison. I'm an author, mostly of science fiction, but thrillers and horror too. And this book for 2026 is called Foundling Fathers from Tachyon Books.
I love Tachyon and I love this book. I am so happy that they put it in my inbox. Before we get to Foundling Fathers itself, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer and perhaps some of your other works?
Absolutely. I only ever wanted to be a writer. I had a brief period in early life when I thought about being an opera singer because I was kind of obsessed with Maria Callas. But it turns out that the cool parts of being an opera singer, where you're just a beloved diva who's over the top eccentric about everything and you get to be very important wherever you go, a lot of that transfers to being an author, so it worked out. Always wanted to write, always wrote stories. My junior high burn book was a sword and sorcery fantasy with the names of my friends in it. I worked on my first novel when I was in my final semester at UC Berkeley, and I had the idea and I knew exactly where I was going to go, but I was afraid if I started work on it, I wasn't going to get through my finals. So I waited. And then the last day of my last final, I got out at like 1:30 in the afternoon. I sat down and I wrote the first 13,500 words of what would become my debut novel. I was sort of impacted. So that was The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, which came out in 2014. It won the Philip K. Dick Award. It was a huge surprise to me. I published it through a tiny micro press called Zeretic Press in Los Angeles. And that really started my career. So I got to explode onto the scene in science fiction. I got to have a big first time novel. I got to re debut that novel again. It was republished, and the subsequent books in that series were also published by 47 North. Since then, I've published a collection with PM Press that's Big Girl, that includes my novelette The Pill, which was nominated for and won a couple of awards, as well as my thriller about parasociality, Number One Fan, my first YA novel, which was Find Layla, that ended up on the list of best books in Vanity Fair that year. I've been very lucky to have the job that I've always wanted to have, and I'm having a great time as an author.
Wow. Wow, what a great story. And, the pill like just changed my brain chemistry. It was so important to me. And not that we want to get too into this or, anything, but like it only horrifies me how much closer we kind of are to that world now than we were
What's
then.
funny, I published The Pill, and it was mostly about my experience with gastric bypass surgery, which my mother had. So The Pill came out of my horror of gastric bypass surgery and the culture surrounding it, and like how it sort of emanates from the person who has it to everyone around them. And everyone who read it then was like, oh yeah, this sounds like gastric bypass surgery, or this sounds like fen-phen, or this sounds like whatever nightmare diet your mother was on in the 90s. And then as more people read it, they just attach whatever's happening to it. So now, of course, it's about GLP-1s. So everybody says that science fiction is prophetic, or that it's timely, or that it's right on what we're all talking about right now, but it's because it's happened before. Like plague fiction isn't always about COVID-19. Sometimes it's about the so-called Spanish flu. It's all happened before. If you're a good student of history, science fiction will reveal itself to you in ways that seem prophetic, but are really just about the way we do the same thing over and over.
That's true. And that's an excellent segue into this novel, which combines history and science fiction. I'd love to know the inception point for this. I know that like asking writers where ideas come from is like ethereal and abstract and difficult to talk about, but I am so fascinated by this premise and where it came from. My headcanon is that you were watching Jurassic Park and reading the Constitution.
That's pretty
Yeah.
good. It was a conversation with my husband about Warhammer. We were out to dinner, we were having sushi, and he asked if he could talk about Warhammer for about 10 minutes without boring me to death. And I have a great deal of patience for this man, so I said, far away. And he was telling me about a specific sect in Warhammer where they've resurrected their founders, their great heroes from the beginning of their civilization, and put their consciousness into like an unkillable body so that they never have to be without that governing idea. But of course, those people are insane. Of course, the inception of a society does not necessarily gel with where the society goes in the future or what it becomes. And I asked him, does it work? And he says, not really. And although I was paying attention to the conversation, I was thinking if we could do that in this country, we absolutely would. We have these originalists, we have these people on the Supreme Court who keep trying to interpret the Constitution in a framework that they've never had, that no longer exists, from a world that is long gone. So if they could bring back the founders, they would absolutely do it. And then the idea was off and running. And you're not wrong. Jurassic Park was in there, like the great cloning stories were in there. There's also a book from the 70s called The Boys from Brazil, which
Mm.
is about a long drawn out plot to clone Hitler. And then when each of the boys turns 12 or 13, they go around assassinating his fathers so that they all have the same experience of losing their father at a critical time in their life as Hitler did. It's a really great like 70s detective history is the real monster novel, and you can basically hear the do wacka do wacka in the background. But I've always loved it, and I've always thought about how complicated it is to try to replicate a human being. Like the cells aren't the half of it. The rest of it is creating the experience that makes you into who you are, which is why I have Washington, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson basically being raised on an island that's set up like the Disneyland of 1750 so that they can have this constructed environment to make them into what we believe those men were.
You know, it says so much about, I think, both how people today want to control the flow of history and the future,
Mhm.
and in general, how a lot of parents kind of want to control their children. There's a lot
Yeah.
going on here about parenting as well.
Mhm.
So on that note, could you talk a little bit about the Antediluvian Society? What goes into building a shadowy cabal for you? Yeah, so what went into building this shadowy cabal for you?
So the shadowy cabal is based on the idea that if you have enough money and enough access, you can control the circumstances of someone's life completely, which I've seen played out on a smaller scale. I went to high school in a rural area where a lot of students entered public high school so that they would have the proof of having graduated, but had been homeschooled their entire lives. And I saw them having to assimilate ideas of how the world actually works as opposed to how they were told it would work, and to have their notions really exploded in basic ways. Like you expect them to have a simplified political view of things or perhaps a biblical worldview of creation. Maybe they don't believe in evolution. All of that is to be expected. But I knew somebody in my high school who at 16 years old had his first ever piece of gum because his parents had not only not let him have gum, he had never gone anywhere where gum was sold or chewed, and he didn't know what it was. He didn't understand that it was foodstuffs that you chewed but did not swallow. So I watched people adjust a fundamental understanding of the universe when they got into public school, and I really thought about how much control a group can exert over a person who's subjected to that kind of control. Like you can literally tell people that our airplanes aren't real, and as long as they never see one, they'll believe you. And that's a macrocosm of parenting, and it's also connected to, as you said, the way that people try to control the teaching of history. If we only tell you how we believe the world has been or how we wish you could understand the world has been, then you won't understand what it really was. So there's so much coercive control on these clones and how they're supposed to think about the world to make them into the people we wish them to be, so that they'll be the kind of leader who ostensibly can think like a freethinker who had the benefit of a great classical education, but also exactly the way that you tell him to. And of course, in the end, that can't work.
Yeah, it is really incredible to me, sort of that I guess the split consciousness or the cognitive dissonance of we want you to be a free thinker who thinks just like us, so and that is
I've
basically what they're doing here. Yeah.
I've heard that from enough classical philosophers. I've heard that from enough conservative thinkers who are like, if I give you the tools to think freely, obviously you'll come to the same conclusions that I have, and then shocked Pikachu face when that is not the outcome.
Yeah. There's one line I think where the woman who's raising them, the woman they think to be their mother, says like, "I keep telling you, this education results in atheists," which is so good.
She's not wrong. And
Yeah.
each of those founding fathers, I read deeply into their biographies and their letters and the statements they made about themselves. And all of them are culturally Christian. Couldn't help but be anything else. But each of them expresses a certain fundamental atheism or an idea that God is not who we've made him out to be. And I can't help but view that as a result of both their education and the terrible circumstances they went through. Like Washington among them has the strongest faith and also had to watch his soldiers get toes cut off for frostbite and witness the cruelty of God in an open war zone in an underfunded insurgent army for a long time. It's really hard to believe in God when you're freezing to death in a foxhole in Virginia.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about depicting the founding fathers, especially in their teens, which is such a great time. Because it is sort of a coming of age for them. It's just not like a lot of other people's coming of age.
It's very different, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, I did a ton of research. These
Mm.
are each of them extremely well documented men. We have letters in their own hand. We have statements from people around them who knew them. We have the descriptions of the speeches that they gave and the figure that they cut in Philadelphia or in Washington. I read all of their letters. I read Ben Franklin's autobiography. I read Jefferson's letters to Adams's wife, which are some of my favorites because they're so catty and sparring with each other. And Jefferson hates women and doesn't think that they should, God forbid, have the vote, but really have any power at all. And he has to deal with Abigail Adams, who's an incredible opponent on that subject. Most of all, I just wanted to get a sense of their personalities. And I loved when Franklin especially reminisces to when he was younger and talks about, well, his prowess in the bedroom for the most part, but what sort of man he wanted to be and how he made it happen. But when they reflect on their youth, it seemed like a more distilled version of their personalities. Like before I had to calm myself down for these people in Washington, before I had to learn to compromise, before I had to really take on the burden of a moral consciousness when I was a strong young man. These are the things that I did. And they're reflecting from all of, 30 or 40, but still. So as those voices began to take shape out of research and what I felt like was a long conversation with them, I realized that it was pretty easy to map them onto the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Wow.
So we have a strong and thoughtful leader. We have one who's always angry and feels like he never gets enough credit. We have the troublemaker who enjoys life more than everybody else. And we have the thinker, the scientist, the one who always has a plan. That's that's the Ninja Turtles, and I got them to be teenagers by doing that. So when I was trying to ask myself what would they do in this situation, or who among them are allies and who among them are enemies, the Ninja Turtles were there for me, as they have been since Eastman and Laird in the 80s, and it really helped me turn them into teens and very young adults rather than the middle-aged men I mostly know them to be.
That's incredible. What powerful archetypes, to
It really works. Like Ben
Yeah.
Franklin is Michelangelo. It's not even barely a change of costume.
Yeah. And you walk a really fine line with them because you portray them in all of their their ugliness to us modern readers. They're racist, they're sexist, they're rapists sometimes. They
Yeah.
believe a lot of terrible things, but you do still feel empathy for them because they're children, or almost children, and they've been lied to their entire lives. It's a balancing act.
It is, and it's really hard to sit with characters who you hate. Like, so it's difficult to get a reader to come along and be like, "This guy's terrible. Read more to find out why." And the truth is, Jefferson is terrible. Jefferson is a rapist. Jefferson has absolutely no conscience about the way he treats other people because he's been taught that he is something better. And the terrible truth is, we still deal with people every day who hold essentially those same values, who act in essentially those same ways with total impunity. This is not a freak out of time. This is a person you meet going to get coffee. And although I believe in reparations, although I believe in an actual process to get forgiveness if you actually deserve forgiveness, part of that process is seeing the perpetrator of these terrible acts as a whole person and recognizing that maybe they were homeschooled in a really terrible environment and there was no other person for them to become. There is another person they could yet become if they keep evolving. You don't have to stay where you're at, but you really have to develop something like empathy in order to believe someone could get forgiveness if they worked for it. So I was doing that with these characters who I started off not liking very much because, of course, I wouldn't. And by the end, having a great deal of sympathy for and believing that they could be better men if they had room and space to be, if they chose to be.
Mm. Yeah. And there's something very interesting too, I think, in the way that they're being raised here, because it's not an exact recreation of the classical education that they would have received. There are some didactions, a couple of changes that the antediluvian society doesn't really want them to encounter. One of the things that like also is very different for these four boys is that none of the actual founding fathers grew up with the pressure of having to found America one day, and
Yep.
these boys did. And I think that creates a lot of empathy for them too.
This terrible expectation on them. But it
Mhm.
also it kind of goes to the question of these people who believe that there was a simpler or better time that we must red vern to. For the most part, they're dealing with a sanitized or a highly edited version of that past that they're not willing to really contend with. The proponents of classical education completely neglect to deal with the fact that it was a pagan education, that it would have been very frank about sex and husbandry and like reproductive cycles in the world. And these boys have been deprived of all of that because I modeled them again on the people I knew who had been homeschooled, who had so little sex education that it really amounted to child abuse. These people went into the world not understanding how humans reproduce and are thus completely prone to disaster on their first outing because the people who educated them would prefer that they were ignorant than they had any knowledge of the fruit of the tree of good and evil. So I really wanted them to describe what they were giving these kids as a classical education and then deprive them of the actual depth of classical education because that's what happens when you sanitize history. There are big parts of it that you are not passing on, even though you think that was a better, simpler, cleaner, purer, fill in the adjective time.
Mm. Absolutely. There's something also here that, is reminding me about, or making me think about rather, the way that I think there is this tendency, especially as like mass culture fragments and people get their news or their perspectives from ever, fragmented sources, that like this idea that you will benefit by never encountering an idea that challenges or discomforts you or tells you that you might be wrong. It reminds me of AI a little bit, like
Very
there's
much.
something about
Just constant,
indoctrination.
yeah, constant reinforcement, constant positive responses to anything that you say. I
Mm.
think that it's slightly more subtle than that. It's the idea that you won't encounter a conflicting idea until you have sufficient emotional investment in it so that any conflict feels like abuse.
Mm.
And we see this over and over again in the electorate. Like, it's not a question of whether or not you can accept new truths if there is evidence behind that truth. It's that the suggestion of new truth hurts you. It assails the question of your character. And I believe that folks who believe in this kind of education, they don't necessarily know that that's what they're doing, but that's what they're doing. It's the same narrative received by converts or deep indoctrination into religion. The question is not, are you unwilling to deal with people who believe differently than you do? The question is, are you able to receive that different belief as anything but an attack on your own?
Mm.
And that's very self-reinforcing. Every time I talk to somebody who's different than me, we end up fighting. Of course, you would stop.
Mhm. Wow, that is a really interesting perspective on it, and that is a very important nuance. So one of the things that I am really curious about with this story is, without giving away too much, I'm very, very antsy about spoilers, and I think this is a read that, going into it as knowing as little as possible really creates like a wild ride of an experience. But eventually, our foundling fathers who have been cut off from outer reality have an encounter with it that
They do
changes
encounter
them.
reality, yes.
Yeah. And I'm really curious about, you know, the act of the imaginative act of looking through our modern world through the founding fathers' eyes and trying to imagine how they would react to it. That brings us back to the question of empathy again, because as a writer, you have to sort of have empathy for their worldview in order to imagine their reactions.
Right.
But did that also reveal anything new about our world to you? Were there any interesting sort of insights that this thought experiment provided for you?
That was really hard to do because I have essentially been online without really logging off since I was 12. And I remember life before the internet, but only vaguely. And the biggest shift that I recall in that change was the distance between the individual and their desires. There were a lot of things that you simply could not lay your hands on before the internet. Maybe you couldn't find like-minded people. Maybe you couldn't figure out where there was an Indian restaurant near you. Maybe you couldn't order the kind of clothes you wanted to wear because they just weren't available where you lived. And now we are all just a few clicks away from our desires if we have a little money. So, with each of them, as they encountered the real world, mostly through the way it is connected now, which is to say the internet, each of them was mostly motivated by their desire, which is, I think, something that's true about everybody. I think desire is a compass. Even if you don't always get it, you go in the direction that it lies. So each of them has their own desire that they bring to it. They really want life to be different from what they've had, or they really want to see things that they haven't seen, or they want to have opportunities to converse with people who they suspect exist but have not yet encountered. So the question for me really wasn't what would scare them or what would confuse them or what would seem forbidding to them. But all the internet does is unfold to what you want. So if each of them brought their wants, what would they look for first? Like if we all had to fight over our very first Google search, what would you ask for in that fight? And that too only brings us closer to those characters by knowing their desires. We empathize with them and we see, maybe most poignantly, what it is they've been denied, what it is they've been forbidden. Most of their desires are so small, so basic. Like imagine never having seen a picture of the Earth from space or even a map of where you live, not understanding your position in the universe in a very real way. So that it makes them small. Again, it makes them very vulnerable. And in their desires, they show us that sometimes the things you want are so small that the scale of it against the backdrop of all that was possible destroys you.
Mm. And I think that does harken to a really important point, especially when we were talking about like sex education and the ways in which the antediluvian society is censoring their education, that the answer to confronting a desire or something like that is never to like pretend it doesn't exist. Like more repression is not the answer to this question, you know?
Ever. Yeah.
And so there is something really fascinating that I guess if we are to view the internet as like a tool in that it is neutral, like yes, it lets Ben Franklin find like porn very, very quickly. But it
Yes.
but it also allows them to sort of like break out of the gaslighting that they've experienced their entire lives.
Very true. And I thought about that for people around my age group who got on the internet as young as we did. For a lot of us, we lacked the vocabulary to describe the way that we felt or even to say out loud what it was we were looking for. And that was true for a lot of my friends who were queer, like me, like maybe we didn't know any gay adults, maybe we didn't know anybody who was out, and then suddenly there they were on the internet, or the fundamental importance of teenagers who began to feel that they were trans, finding out that there's a word for that, that there is a solution to that problem, that there are people who have done it and are alive on the other side. And that lack of vocabulary, that terrible stultifying feeling of not being able even to form the question of what am I looking for, is it's so unmooring. Like you are, the most fundamental human tool is communication. We all find a way to do it, no matter what our limitations are. And when you cannot communicate not only what you want, but what you are, because that is what determines what you want, you're at a severe disadvantage. I mean, it's as bad as anything can be. Like, how do I even say who I am? What is my name? Where did I come from? And in the end, these boys are dealing with both the question of who am I, because I don't know, and why is what I was given to believe a lie? Which is part of growing up. You figure out what parts of your family history are myth and what parts of who you are you were told that don't actually belong to you, and how you rebuild, how you decide what your name will be, how you decide what you will do to move forward. And being able to find people like you or even people you think might be like you on the internet or on something like it is essential to that process.
Hmm. It's just so lovely. It's so funny. And but in addition to being really funny, it is I think ultimately very hopeful, even though it's accurately cynical about, I think, human impulses and perhaps our society and government, but it's reaffirming. And it was just such a great read, and I'm so excited to recommend this to people.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. Thank you. And I am, against all odds, an optimist. And I like the idea that in America you get to be who you decide you are. That might be the single thing we come out of this next revolution with intact. The rest of it is built on lies, the rest of it is built on plunder, the rest of it is built on the mythology of the founding fathers, who were a lot worse and a lot more than we make them out to be. But if what we retain is this is the land where you decide who you are, that it's not a matter of your parentage or your inherited wealth or your caste or your tribe, and you come here, you change your name, you decide who you are, that's what I always thought we were. That's what I would like us to move forward in being. That's why I'm so excited to have this come out around the 4th of July, around the 250th, around the Rev 250 events that are happening here in New England where I live. It is extremely suited to the question of what does it mean to be an American? And I have to tell you, the answer to that is that it's mostly a joke.
Well said. Well said now and in the book overall. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Just one last question that I always end with. What is on the horizon for you? Are you writing right now?
I am writing right now. I really love the dark academia genre, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. And as a graduate of a California community college, I had the idea, like, what if dark academia at a community college where there is a lot less oversight and where most people are adults and where things happen and you might get away with them. So I hope that that is my next published project, but you never know in this business, so we'll see.
Oh my gosh. Well, okay, I'm going to tell all of our listeners, please buy Foundling Fathers so that I can read this one. This is
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
You're so welcome. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.